I haven't had a chance to meet you yet or interact with you. I'm Steve Smith. I'm president at Berkshire Choral International. I started at BCI last September, so I have had a very interesting first year in my job. And I've worked for choruses most of my life. I'm a nonprofit geek and proud of it. And I've led two large community choruses. I've led the Seattle Men's Chorus and Seattle Women's Chorus in Seattle, Boston Gay Men's Chorus in Boston. And I was also executive director of a regional theater company called Revels based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And each of these organizations largely has been dependent on ticket revenue, had various degrees of safety net or no safety net. So, much of my work as a nonprofit leader has been juggling small and large crises as they happen. When I joined as a very young executive director, I was the first employee and only employee of the Boston Gay Men's Chorus. And we were poor enough that we actually had to, on Saturdays, go to the local softball league games and collect bottles and cans for redemption, trying to meet payroll. So I have been in the trenches, and I hope I can share a little bit of what I've learned with you tonight. And thank you all for being here. And we're going to talk about preparing your chorus to succeed in a changing and changed world. First, because this is free, you get a 30-second advertisement before we begin. So in case you're new to Berkshire Choral, we're an organization that creates amazing one-of-a-kind experiences for choral people. If we had had a normal summer this summer, you could have sung with us in Symphony Hall in Boston with Grant Gershon, or you could have traveled to Barcelona with us and sung Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. So we work with great conductors and amazing venues and create these one-week experiences that are sort of, summer camp for choral nerds, as I like to say. And in this time when we can't sing in person, we've, like everybody else, turned online. And so we have a singer resource page, and we have a growing variety of online warm-ups. We've been doing program interviews with conductors and a 3-part series for folks to sort of dig in and learn Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. So if you are a choral singer yourself and want to take a look at what we'll be doing through the rest of the fall and through the winter, love it if you take a look at that. So our agenda for the evening, okay, 2020. Seriously, I mean, everything that's happened down to Alex Trebek, it's enough. So our agenda for the evening is to first talk a little bit about the complicated environment that we find ourselves in. I'm going to suggest some ways to think about priorities for the short term. And I will be honest that I don't really know what the short term is, but it's shorter than the long term. And then we'll sort of segue and talk about how to prepare your chorus culture to meet this changing world. And if we were meeting in person, this would be much more fun if we had a whiteboard and could share a lot of things. But I've created a self-guided action plan, which we'll email you tomorrow. And that will give you a chance to some questions that you can ask yourself or work with your colleagues at home. We'll go over a little bit tonight, but it's a way to sort of take what we're talking about tonight and add some action to that. So with all of that prelude, I should also just say a couple of things. My opinions are not medical or legal advice, and my opinions are mine and not necessarily those of my organization. I hope there's not a lot of daylight there, but if I make you angry, please be angry at me and not at BCI. And I will make some points about social issues that in the environment we find ourselves, some people could interpret as political. And I am trying very hard. There's nothing partisan about what I want to say, but I will be very frank with my opinions that there are some of the ways that we need to think about what's happening in the world, some people will consider to be political, so you're forewarned. And my last caveat is that I'm going to make a lot of generalizations. I think there are folks in this room of choruses of all different kinds of permutations and size and staff structure. And I'm really gearing this towards small and mid-sized organizations with limited or no staff. That's sort of my orientation for the evening. When we take questions at the end, I'm happy to make time. If something I say doesn't make sense to your situation, I'm glad to try to figure it out with you. So all of that said, we will begin. There are really at least 3 crises that I think are sort of facing our world as choral singers. And the first, obviously, is COVID-19. And it has really turned into an existential threat just to the art of choral singing and the ways that we're used to being with each other and connecting and enjoying that. I think there will be health and economic issues that will make this an insecure situation until a vaccine is widely distributed. And let's put emphasis on the term widely distributed. I think with this comes recession or an uncertain financial recovery that at least so far we've seen has affected people of different in different economic situations in very different ways. And having survived the recession of 2008, arts organizations are always lagging indicators. So I have a fairly well-formed sense that some of the badness has not hit us yet and will. And I think, you know, there are going to be long-term changes to how group activities happen, things that we have taken for granted. You know, having snacks at a table during your chorus break, or something as simple as that we never give a sort of second thought to, may for a time be quite different. And, you know, well, you know, this week there's hopeful news about vaccines. What we don't know is when that really will honestly be widely distributed. And at what point that will sort of allow us to go back into the rehearsal room. My current take, and Chorus America and ACDA have done, you know, really great workshops with medical people through this crisis, talking about the research that's been done. And if you haven't seen those yet, they're online on their various YouTube channels. And you know that, again, I'm no medical expert, but here's my take, my sort of big picture take on where we are. There are examples of choruses functioning at the moment, generally small groups, singing with extreme social distancing, like in a very large chapel or in an outdoor setting, obviously with masks, and in situations where there's extraordinary ventilation. There is nothing I have seen in the research or practical application that makes sort of large group singing choruses of 40 or more people indoors safe. Like all of the world that we live in, I mean, masks can protect us to some degree, but when you're in a room with all of us singing, it creates so much particulate matter that I am not comfortable that until there are widespread vaccinations, we should safely sing together. I think that is likely to not be until late spring, and you know, as the last months have unfolded, I think we're all ready for good news and sort of prepared for continued less than good news. And I also know that there are regional differences in how the public is responding to COVID recommendations. Again, it's my opinion, arts organizations are risking their reputations and their trust with their singers and audiences if we get too far ahead of the curve on this. So I personally couldn't recommend a choral organization pushing the envelope until we know more about what's happening with sort of medical intervention. Next crisis, the crisis of injustice. Now, Black Lives Matter was a crisis before George Floyd's murder, but his murder and far too many other racist events have, I think, created, I don't know if it's a new awareness, a broader awareness, and a change dynamic that will not allow us to return to the way that things were. And this is here's one of my controversial points for you. I don't actually care how you or your singers feel about this issue. What I want to tell you with my consultant hat on is that as a nonprofit organization, if we don't get evolve a better embrace of community inclusion, the world is going to pass us and what we do by. Already, I can tell you that the funding community is way ahead on this. And if you are not doing more sophisticated work around inclusion, you're not going to be publicly funded. I think audiences are going to expect this from us, and the community that we live in has a right to expect it from us. And so I think this is a fundamental shift that is happening. It is probably not a stretch for me to make a generalization that a majority of us on the call tonight are members of largely white-led organizations. And I think it's our responsibility to understand our role in systemic racism and to take action to do a better job in choruses representing Black and Brown and other underrepresented people and cultures, and to engage in that conversation with a sense of courage. Speaking for myself, I know often I have felt that my intent is good, and I sometimes temper that good intent because I'm afraid to make a mistake. And I think if one thing I have learned in the past few months is it's okay to make mistakes if you are humble and willing to apologize and learn from them. And I think that can't be a crutch that we lean on. So this is an area where I feel as we evolve from the COVID situation, it is another sea change in how our choruses are going to, the world that we're going to find ourselves in. And lastly, dysfunctional civic discourse. To my mind, there's an epic breakdown of trust and logic and even knowing what science is or knowing what math is. And I know that we're all, I'm going to assume that many of us are feeling tender coming off the divisive election, where, you know, even the simple act of wearing a mask has become a great political argument. And so for me, I mean, I feel like we've lost our way as a civil society, but I also think it's a great opportunity as choruses. Because one of the reasons I love the work that choruses do, it's borne out by research that Chorus America has done that's shown that choral communities are more civically engaged, vote at almost double the rate of the populace. We're healthier, we're able to forge relationships and bridge differences in more sophisticated ways than the general public. So I feel like the work we do can become a model for the kind of society we deserve. And that's a huge opportunity if we choose to make it part of our mission. So for me, how do we take the world that we're living in that is dealing with illness, that is dealing with lack of justice and has lost its ability to talk to each other, how do we make that world more like a chorus? Because to me, a chorus is a place where every voice is welcome, safe, heard, and respected. So what I want to talk about tonight is some efforts we can take to move our organizations in that direction. So the first challenge, this is surviving and thriving. We'll start with surviving. And you have all been on an airplane, I'm guessing. We put your tray table in an upright position and put your oxygen mask on before assisting others, if it comes to that. And as stewards of our organizations, I think it's our responsibility to ensure their survival. And we have to look after ourselves first in doing that. To me, there's one question that should be driving your actions. And that is, what do we need to do now to ensure that our organization is alive and financially viable when we can resume singing in person for audiences? And there are, you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and all of us we've become experts in virtual choruses and parking lot concerts and things that we couldn't have imagined 6 or 9 months ago. But the operating for all of us is really based on rehearsing in person and performing in person. And as much as the world may change around us, that's not going to change anytime soon. So how do we think about making it to the other side of an era of social distancing, which keeps us from doing what we love to do? And what I really want you to think about is our organizations, most of them have really limited resource options, and this is a marathon. And if we run out of resources before we get to the finish line, and we don't know where the finish line is, it's kind of a wasted effort. Because let's say, for example, we're able to sing together again relatively safely in September, but your organization has only had the resources to make it to July, and you find yourselves bankrupt or unable to move forward. It is really important that we try to pace ourselves and plan so that we can get to that sort of evolving finish line. A lot of this material has been a group called Data Arts, and at the end of this presentation, I'll email you some links where you can read more about this. You know, when COVID struck here in Massachusetts, I think it was March 16th was my last day in the office. And I thought, I was sort of looking around like, what do I need to work from home? And I was putting stuff in my briefcase and I'm like, oh, it'll be a couple of weeks or a month. And, you know, here we are however many months later, because I can't do math in my head. We never thought it would be this long. And I think the best case scenario for us returning to singing in person is 6 months from now. It could be 9 months from now. So it's this pacing ourselves as a marathon that I think is so important. And 4 ways I want to think about doing that. And the first is avoiding magical thinking. Magical thinking is believing in things more strongly than evidence or experience justifies. Magical thinking is saying it's going to magically disappear. And as artists, I mean, we create imagination and surprising things every day in the work we do. We create magic in that way. And we have passion for what we do, but that passion is not always our friend, because I feel like it sometimes blinds us, our personal passion, the importance that we put on the art that we do, of being with other singers and people that do the work that we do. It can blind us to what's really going on. Our audience may love what we do, but we can't count on them to be there necessarily unless we give them a reason to be. So while what we do is important, I think we need to have a realistic sense of where we fit into the ecosystem, because hope is not the best strategy. And so that's why I think we need to confront the brutal facts of our current situation. Jim Collins in his his book, Good to Great, talks about this a lot. And again, this is painful to sort of take a clear-eyed look, make a clear-eyed assessment of your organization's opportunities and its weaknesses. But if you don't know where you truly stand, I don't think you can make a great plan of how to move on. And the third point I want to make here is that this is the time to brainstorm what I call a stop doing list. And, in musical terms, it's an opportunity for a deep breath, or to sort of put a fermata on what we've been doing. Particularly for organizations where your resources are extremely limited, you have little or no cash in the bank, hanging on from month to month is something that you actively have to worry about. We may need to go so far as to put our organizations in suspended animation. If our goal is to be around and viable when what we do returns, we can't squander resources today on sort of getting by. Many of us were used to muddling through in many ways, and that's a great gift. But talk with people in your organization and think seriously about, are we doing things, are we spending money on things right now that aren't absolutely crucial, that are potential barriers to our having enough money in the bank to resume? And if they are, we need to think about some of the tough decisions to sort of put a hold on those. Next area is to act with financial rigor. And I think the most important point here is to understand and to try to set aside, to the extent you can, the minimum financial resources you will need to resume operations. Now, again, if you have a little bit of a nest egg and you have a pathway to get to, let's call it next September, terrific. But again, particularly if you're a chorus that sort of goes year to year and concert to concert for revenue, what I want you to think about now is, I have a really oversimplified example here. So let's say that your first rehearsal back in person with your chorus is September 1st, and your first concert where your revenue will magically appear is December 4th. How much cash on hand do you need to sort of make that concert happen? And, what would you need to pay your conductor and accompanist during that 3 or 4 month period? What would you need for rehearsal space? Would you need to make a deposit on your concert venue? Do you have minimum resources that you can promote the concert in whatever way that you do? What else might be on that list? Again, from the smallest choruses to more sophisticated organization, that's a very different list. But if you go back and look at a previous year's general ledger, you can see where all of your money went. And so you could work with your accounting folks to sort of figure out, gee, in the barest minimum, what are the expenses that are required for us to put on a concert? So I'm going to suggest that if your organization hasn't yet sort of figured out what that dollar figure is, that's something you need to do. And if you have that money now, you need to set it aside. And if you don't have it, I think that needs to be the focus of whatever fundraising or search for resources that you do over the winter, so that you can begin to put that sort of nest egg aside. And an analogy is sort of a riptide. I grew up on the coast of Maine, and although I'm not a swimmer, every summer I would watch the TV news, and they would run the requisite story of what to do if you're swimming in the ocean and you get caught in a riptide. And of course, the tide pulls you away from shore. And in fact, the currents don't pull you under. What happens to you is that when you try to swim against the tide, you tire yourself out. And that's why people get into trouble or even perish. But if you sort of tread water and let the tide take you further out, it sort of mellows out and you're able to swim sort of around the riptide and around it and back to shore. And I think that's a really good analogy for thinking about how we have to think. The trip back is longer, but it's safer. And if you spend all your energy trying to swim against the tide right now, you may not have the energy to be there when we get back to this splendid time when we can come back together. And I also want you to think about the fact that probably you need multiple scenarios of knowing when that timeline that we're going to restart is. Last I looked, and it could have changed, I think Broadway currently has, kicked the can down the road at least until May of 2021 when they're going to restart performances. Metropolitan Opera has already said that it's not going to be until fall of 2021. And my intuition says if we catch every lucky break and our new government does an amazing job of distributing the vaccine, maybe we'll be able to sing late this spring or this summer or this fall. So again, as you're thinking like, what's the marathon I'm running? I think you need to have a number of answers towards that. This is the most depressing part of the presentation, by the way. It does get a little less awful. I have one more terrible slide to show you. This is from a researcher that I love to follow. Again, you'll get the link in an email. Her name is Colleen Dillon Schneider, and she has been doing amazing research on audiences' willingness to come back to public venues during the COVID crisis and beyond. And this is some projections that she did in terms of audiences for performing arts organizations. What's the market potential that we can expect as we recover? So this straight sort of middle blue line here, this is audience demand sort of on a constant if COVID had not happened. And it dips only slightly because the audience for performances is very slightly diminishing year over year currently. So that's a phenomenon that we knew about and theoretically could deal with. The sharp decline here obviously is what happened when COVID struck. And I mean, I think clearly most of us didn't even have 20% of our audiences in place. But as she has projected what's likely to happen, here's my cursor again, as we get into the middle of next year, the middle of 2021, she's only projecting that 2/3 of the audience will be willing or ready to come back. And going into the year 2022, it gets up to about 90%. Now, if you had told me that next year's ticket sales are going to drop off 10%, that would make me freak out. If you tell me they're going to be off by 30% or 40%, that is really difficult. This research also does not presume that there are any sort of restrictions in concert halls. So let's say there's a period of time where we continue some degree of social distancing with seats not so close together or who knows what. So I think it is unrealistic for us to assume that once we're back and singing together, that audiences are going to snap back into place in the way that we previously expected them to. I think it's going to be a gradual thing as people feel comfortable coming back out into public events and as the science sort of takes over. So there's some horrible things to think about. Third part of what I think we need to do to keep our organizations viable is rally your internal community. And I've really been struck with this theory of ambiguous loss. If you think about, working through the phases of grief, ambiguous loss is the situation where there isn't closure or a clear understanding. And it is this definition I'm using, it leaves a loss for a person searching for answers and complicates and delays the process of grieving and can result in unresolved grief. And in my experience, that's what a lot of our choruses and our singers are experiencing. This weekly ritual, for the 20 years that I lived in Boston, my Wednesday night chorus rehearsal was the one thing I planned my week around. And I think we as singers are really struggling with the loss of sort of that ritual, that tradition. And our audiences are struggling with that too. And as I think about the holiday season coming and the fact that people are not going to be able to go to holiday performances and have that communal experience and not go to parties, I think the country is in for its most emotionally difficult period of this crisis. So I want you to think about how you in your internal chorus community can help people cope with this sense of ambiguous loss. I think there are some low and no cost things that you can do to care for your singers and maybe your close supporters, subscribers or major donor, folks that you have a relationship with. And I won't get into a lot of them here, but I've seen choruses, not only are they continuing to hold rehearsals, they're having trivia nights and social events on Zoom. I think there were opportunities to do some things around public service, all kinds of things. And all of this comes to the fact that we have an unusual sense of non-singing time. We have singers who are used to spending time with us. We have not the usual things to do with them. How can we make the best use of that time with them to help them stay involved with their organizations, perhaps become better singers or to expand their listening, their ears? I think that's an opportunity for us. And my last point here is around communication. The first being that transparent leadership inspires trustworthy behavior from people. We often fear, if we air our dirty laundry, if we tell our singers or our donors, too much about what's happening, we'll scare them away. Or we feel intimidated as leaders because we don't know all the answers and we have to get in public or however we're communicating with people and show that we don't have all the answers to what's going on. But people, to stay engaged with you, need to feel like they have enough information to know what's happening honestly. So my example here at BCI in March, when it was very unclear that we could move forward with our summer plans, there was really a period of almost a month where COVID had overtaken Europe and it was unclear what was happening in this country. But we communicated with our registered singers regularly to let them know how we'd be making decisions, what we thought the timeframe for those decisions were. And we told them up front that we would refund their tuitions if they trusted us to give us a few weeks to wait and see how the situation unfolded. My experience is that trust that we showed by being honest was paid back to us. More than half of the folks that had prepaid tuition with us donated a portion of that back to us as a charitable donation. And that has really made the difference for my organization this year. So transparent leadership is very important. As part of that, I think you need to develop a shared vision and narrative for how your organization will get through the COVID crisis. And I'm calling this, what's the story I can believe in? For us here at BCI, the narrative that we've developed is that we need to preserve this opportunity, these experiences that we create for the current and for future generations of singers. And, before COVID ever struck, one of our challenges was to attract new singers into our BCI family. And so we've been using our online programs as a way to attract people who didn't otherwise know about us and begin to get to know us and for us to communicate them with. So we've been inspiring our singers with this vision that we're using this time to be sure that we're here for you for the future and for future generations, and in a way that overall strengthens our position. Because people give, up to a point, people will give to need. My fundraising lecture is a whole nother time. But too often people who are doing fundraising think that they ask for money because we need the money. And what I want you to think about is to ask for money to give people a chance to invest in a shared solution to this problem. if people feel like they're making an investment in making something good happen, they will give more and they will give more often. So that's the inspiration piece. And in a slightly different vein, but I'm sort of leaving it here in Communicate, let's talk for just a moment about creating online content. John Perales, who's the pop music critic for the New York Times, sort of did a big compendium article this summer about all of the free concerts and online materials that he had found. And his first sentence was, "So many good intentions, so little joy." It is amazing that we can create virtual chorus performances and all the different ways that we have found to do bits and pieces of this choral art that we love. But all of them are makeshift in some way. And it is great to do them. If you have the resources, you absolutely should do some of these things. If you have a reason to do it, if you're engaging your singers, if you're finding a way to communicate with your supporters. But there is also a glut of content right now. There's like a Met opera performance every night of the week. I can't possibly keep up with that. And every orchestra in the country has opened up its archives. There's so much out there that people can't take it in. And despite the fact that you're on a Zoom call at 8:30 at night with me, you also probably spent part of your workday on this. And that's kind of the last thing you want to do is look at a screen. So if you have the resources to do smart online content, you absolutely should do it. But if you are a chorus with really limited resources and you are squandering resources you have now that you will need later for something that's not going to make that much difference, I just ask you to do that carefully. End of that lecture. So we're in this COVID crisis. Here are some strategies or ways to think about how to get through that. Let's move a little bit to the other challenge, which is how to position our organization to thrive after we get out of this immediate crisis. And the question here is, are we going back to the same world we left? And should we? Because I would say that maybe it wasn't working that well anyway. So I'm going to show you a quote. I guess most of you have probably seen it. Those of you that run organizations probably have used it more than once. Bernstein, who said, "This will be our reply to violence, to make music more intensely, more beautifully, more devotedly than ever before." And I know specifically after 9/11, I used this quote in the way that we communicated about how we were hanging in there. And I think I've used it on a number of occasions of crisis. And I was executive director at Seattle Men's and Women's Chorus during the Pulse nightclub massacre in Orlando a few years ago. And I needed something. I needed some way to respond to the horror of that violence. And I reflexively went to this quote, but I will tell you that I read it with new eyes and it felt terribly inadequate to me. Because with today's eyes, I can also, a way I could read this quote is, this will be our reply to stay firmly rooted in our comfort zone, do exactly what we always do and hope that it matters to you. Now, I know Bernstein didn't mean that, but with today's sort of more enlightened eyes, this is sort of an ivory tower approach. And I was so disappointed in Lenny. I'm like, you have inspired me. You have failed me. But I went back to the source material. So this quote was part of a speech that Bernstein gave 2 weeks after JFK was assassinated. And he was giving a speech at a United Jewish Appeal dinner. Here is that quote with the sentence before it that everyone leaves off. "But this sorrow and rage will not inflame us to seek retribution. Rather, they will inflame our art. Our music will never again be quite the same." And at least for my ears, that's the quote that we need today. How do we inflame, how do we inspire our art for a world that will never again be quite the same? Not quite the same, at least for some time, in how we feel about being together in public places with each other, and particularly in the spirit of wanting to be a more inclusive, more just society. So positioning our organization for that changed world, a lot of this is about programming. It's about what we sing and where and for whom we sing it. And a lot of it really is decided in how we make decisions or how we don't make decisions in our organizations. And here's one of the things I've learned after I won't say it's not too many years because I love it, but a lot of years of running choruses. is this choral framework. This is, for me, how we make decisions in our organizations, both explicitly and implicitly. Sort of have three ways of thinking. This framework around the singer, the individual singer's interest, around the organization's self-interest, and around the interest of our community. So the singer self-interest frame, this is that personal experience of participants in the organization. And in most of our courses, there's some blend of volunteerism, of artistic fulfillment, of personal relationships and friendships, of the music. And again, I think in many of our courses, each person's there for their own matrix of those reasons. And that's a complex thing to manage. There's the us framework or frame that represents for me what's sort of that united choral vision. This could be a strong artistic director's artistic vision. It could be the mission of your organization. It's how we forge sort of the broad areas of agreement of what we're going to do and why we stay there and do it together. And the fact that we choose to put the best interests of our organization sometimes above our personal preferences. Maybe I don't love Brahms and we were doing the Brahms Requiem for the 4th time, but I'm invested in this organization and I like the people, so, I'll do Brahms again. Not the worst choice you can make in the world, but you get my point. And then we have the everyone framework, the community interest frame. And this is how I think the organization serves and interacts with our audiences, with donors, civic leaders, organizations that we interact with, and with the community beyond our immediate interactions. And if you're a nonprofit organization, you are legally required to provide public value. That's why we can raise money and not pay taxes on it. So it's that public value piece. So, you're leading, you're part of the leadership of a chorus, and we have this framework and we're balancing these things, and there's this beautiful intersection where all of these things come together. But in reality, my experience looks more like this. Me and us have primacy, sometimes fighting a little against each other. And this community framework, this everyone, is the stepchild down in the corner with a very small overlap between the me and the us values. And as I looked at this to me also is a diagram of what systemic racism actually looks like. Unintentional most of the time when I think of our choruses, but if you think of what we already know and the people we already know doing our thing, that doesn't necessarily give room for the voices that we're not hearing and not interacting with. So these frameworks, there were these competing priorities between what singers want, what the organization wants to do artistically, and then there's our role in the community. So with this sort of lack of alignment here, how do we elevate that community frame so that this comes more into balance? First, it does require intentional balance. It's understanding that the choices that you're making are competing priorities. That does not make them bad. It's not necessarily a bad thing that they compete, but it requires you to make choices. And boy, if there's one thing we like to avoid sometimes as leaders, is making choices, because then people will criticize us for them. So there's really a need to want to find balance from what we're doing to what we would prefer to do. There's an element of creating singer understanding and buy-in of our vision, particularly if our organization has sort of gone about its sort of concert to concert singing without a lot of thought around its role in the community. Moving towards that is going to require a fair amount of effort of bringing people on board about why you want to do that and what the value of it is. Programming that responds to and builds authentic connection with broader communities and issues is a big and complicated piece. Let me talk about a couple pieces of that. Programming is often sort of a fraught issue, because on the one hand, it gets into issues of taste, and you have an artistic director who you have hired and love because of their great taste and their sense of direction. And I don't want to get in the way of that. But those of us who were brought up in the Western classical music tradition really have blinders on. That is what we love, and we sort of we define what excellence is, we define what quality is through what we know. And that's a blind spot if you want to think more broadly about how we can respond to people. Another way where programming gets in the way of this is most of us are reliant on ticket sales, on our audiences. And there's always a lot of pressure. I have probably put this pressure on my artistic directors before, and I think I know a lot that put it on themselves. But stick with what's safe because it means ticket sales will be stable. And so we sort of stick with the Mozart Requiem and the Brahms and whatever it might be for your chorus, out of a sense that we can't stray too far from what we think will sell. But here's something I have found, particularly if you are a community chorus. The bulk of your audience is made up of family and friends. The repertoire really doesn't matter to a majority of them. They're coming because the singers and their friends have asked them to. So it's not that taste and the experience they have is irrelevant, but what's really driving their attendance are personal relationships. So if you were doing programming that your chorus is enthusiastic about, your audience will also be enthusiastic about it. And then I want to talk a little bit about an orientation that expands beyond performing for. We often, there's an outdated word called outreach. We used to talk, and God knows I used it a lot, and still have to catch myself from using it. But the way that we want to engage with other people is outreach, which is sort of a cultural colonialism. We have the answer, we know what we do, we want more people to find it, and so we're going to go take it to those people. Put that in a little American historical context, and you can sort of realize how awful that sounds. So instead of performing for, I would like us to think about a conversation where we start listening to and singing with other people. And again, this could be an entirely different workshop. But in developing authentic relationships with different communities, different causes from the ones that we know, requires us to listen. It may require us to go to, let's say, you want to engage with part of your African-American community more authentically. There's a huge listening part, because I can tell you, my African-American friends have told me they can, from a mile away, they can see you coming, and that you want them to come to your thing, and then that's where the relationship stops. So it's really having a conversation and listening to them. How can we partner together? What is it that you need that we might be able to do? And from a collaboration standpoint, what would singing with you look like? Again, I could go on an hour-long tangent, but I think you get the idea there. And my last piece of advice is don't try to boil the ocean. Small steps are smart, particularly for small organizations and for small organizations dealing with some degree of crisis or instability. So none of our small organizations are going to solve racism in our community next year. We're not going to do it with one concert that's, ludicrous. But we can do small steps, and we can do things that begin to move us in that direction. And I would encourage you to do that. So I'm going to take a deep breath here, sort of stop for a second, and then we're going to move to questions and answers in a few minutes. But I have developed a worksheet that I'll send out to you that are some ways that you can sort of guide this conversation further for you. And I want to talk through that. So action plan in two directions, sort of part one and part two of this. So in terms of COVID organizational preparedness, I will ask you to go away and list at least 3 ways that you think the post-COVID world will be different for your singers, in terms of rehearsal, in terms of preparation, in terms of what concerts look and feel like. And to think of ways that you think that the world will be different for your audiences. Will standing in line for tickets look and feel the same? Again, will we in the immediate future be sitting next to each other in the same way? If our concert has a 20-minute intermission and we don't have enough restrooms, how does that look and feel in the current environment? So the audience experience, I think, is going to be markedly different and something we need to think about. What could your organization be doing now to address some of those issues and changes? And then we go back to some of the stuff I talked about earlier. Have you identified sort of what your realistic financial path is to get to a more normal time? Assuming we do get back, well, not assuming, when we do get back to in-person concerts, have you set aside that that cash flow or those funds so that you can resume what you're doing. If audiences don't come back all at once, have you thought about what implications that has for your operations plan, for the staffing that you have, for what concerts will look like? And here's a really important question. Are the majority of strategic and budget decisions that your organization is making right now focused on your return or on present day operations? Now, I'm not naive. You have to think about today as well, and I don't mean to sell that short. But if the bulk of your energy isn't going to where do we need to be instead of where we are, then I think you're missing out on the preparation that you need. And then in terms of being ready for a changed environment, I want to invite you to think about describing how your organization creates public value. And, this is not a grand statement. These are just bullet points or short sentences. How do you serve the larger community? And where I want to caution you is if more than one of those points is talking about artistic excellence, you sort of fail to grasp the exercise that we're working towards. And don't get me wrong, excellence is important. And excellence is not at the exclusion of any of the other things that we're doing. But too often we use that as a crutch. It's easy to say, we're doing excellent work. And I am sorry, I am hard pressed to tell you how the fact that your Mozart is better than the next person's Mozart is really serving great public value in the current day and age. So depending on where your organization is in its sort of evolution of these thoughts, you may be doing lots of things in education and public service that help create public value. But that's an important conversation to have. And then I would challenge you with your colleagues at your home course, think about what is one new community connection or collaboration or a project or a cause, could be any of those things, that your organization could become involved with over the next 3 to 6 months. Well, we're still social distancing, well, we're still probably not together as singers, to broaden your community relevance. Because again, this is time that we will never get back. When I occasionally consult on strategic planning or something with another organization, what I always hear is we never have time to do this. And boy, do I know that, because just rehearsing and preparing concerts and putting them on and recovering and doing it all over again 3 or 4 times a year, it's exhausting. And there is not a spare day and there's not a spare week. But in many cases, we have that right now. So there's no time like the present, and you don't, the best way to start is to start doing something. So I would ask you to think with your colleagues about what is one thing that you can do to begin to get this under your fingers, to use a keyboard analogy, to begin to experiment with engaging with different ideas, different people, different segments of your community. And to do that, you're going to need to think about what will it take internally to make that happen. What's the time? What are the resources? Externally, what would it take to make that happen? And perhaps most importantly, who do you need as allies? Because everyone is not going to immediately be on board with this kind of expansion or elevation of what you're doing. So who do you need to have as allies so that this sort of isn't a stillborn idea? And lastly, again, how could you dedicate some of your member time and attention while we're here to advance your organization in this everyone framework that I'm talking about? If this is new or newer work for your organization, now would be a great time to begin those conversations when you have the time. I hope that it gives you at least a little bit of structure to think about some of these issues more clearly and to come up with some next steps for your own course, your own ideas. If you have questions, if you want to send me an email, my email will be on those materials. Feel free to send me an email, and I'd be happy to, if you have a point or a question, I'd be happy to talk with you offline about it. All right, well, I appreciate your time. I hope this has been somewhat helpful in helping you or your courses to think about how to get through this extraordinary time. There is no right answer. I literally feel every day, I try not to say the word literally, but I actually every day feel like I'm making up something out of thin air. And part of the time it works, and that's a victory. So I encourage you to take the same spirit of experimentation, and hopefully we will be back together singing in a few months. Thanks all very much.
Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel.